in his direction, even in his last game at Albuquerque, when he knew he had already been called up to the Dodgers, and this was going to be his last game in AAA. The last out of the game was a fly ball hit his direction, and he switched the glove from his left hand to his right hand as he caught the fly ball, and he told the manager, "Now you've got something to talk about me when I'm gone." you know, so he wasn't seen as the easiest guy to quote unquote control at that point. He resisted that type of control, I think, especially from these older white men that maybe didn't really take the time to try to understand him. Al Campanis, really liked Glenn as a minor leaguer, was hoping and, wanted him to become a part of the starting lineup in Los Angeles, would ask the managers to keep a special eye on Glenn in spring training. He had Reggie Smith room with Glenn to keep an eye on him. So he was someone that they thought had all the tools, and, in sort of the sports terminology, might be a little head case, is the way they saw it. And if they felt like if they could cool him down, was the way Junior Gilliam put it, that he had all the potential in the world.
So a big part of the Glenn Burke story is that he was a gay man, and that he was known to be gay to many of his teammates with the Dodgers. But when did he first come out to himself, so to speak? When did he first realize he was gay?
Yeah, he talked about the fact that it wasn't something he really thought much about as a teenager. Certainly in high school, he hadn't come out yet. While he was in junior college, he hadn't come out yet, and he spent almost all of his time playing baseball and basketball, and really just wasn't dating, and didn't think too much of it. It was when he was in Waterbury as a minor leaguer that he first started to consider that this might be a part of who he was. And he remembered an older mentor type figure, a teacher back from the Bay Area, that he wanted to talk about this with when he got back home during the off season, someone that he suspected was gay also, and might be able to provide some advice to him. And this turns out to be the person that he has his first sexual experience with also. And from that point forward, he didn't necessarily live a closeted life. He did somewhat for a little while to his teammates, but during the off season, being in the Bay Area, the Castro district was right across the bridge. And so, he wasn't hiding it. He would spend the off season in the Castro. He invited this man from the Bay Area to Waterbury to stay with him, and invited one of his closest friends to meet him, so that was a really sort of courageous / dangerous move for Glenn to make at that time, to share who he was with a teammate, not knowing what the reaction would be. And also, even if his teammate Marvin Webb, who found out, were to talk about it with other players, not even in a judgmental way, if the word got out to management, Glenn feared that his career could be over, but he wasn't going to hide it. So there was sort of, it was a tough existence for Glenn through the rest of his minor league career, where certain players knew or suspected. And then once he gets up to the Dodgers, some of his teammates start to suspect, because they see things like Glenn not always going out with them. If they had girls over to the hotel after a game, Glenn would excuse himself, make up an excuse that he had to go shopping, or he had to call his mom. When the team would arrive back home in LA after a road trip, the rest of the guys would all head in one direction. Glenn would go to the far end of the airport to get picked up by they didn't know who, it would be one of Glenn's boyfriends at the time. So there was never a press conference or a sort of a public coming out story while Glenn was an active major league player. That didn't happen until 2 years after his pro days were over.
It is really interesting to read about it, though, because, to this day, we've never had an openly gay major league player while he was active, right? And
right.
You sort of think of the 70s, that must have been really tough. And I'm sure it was really tough in a lot of ways, but it is kind of remarkable to read about the things you just described, that he was hiding it, but he wasn't hiding it. And a lot of his teammates didn't really seem to hold it against him or care that much. You know what I mean? It's kind of surprising to see that the attitude was maybe a little different than we would suspect it would have been in the 70s.
Yeah, the attitude amongst his teammates was was very supportive, I would say. Guys, but I think that the fact that he was with the team with so many strong veteran, uh, such a strong veteran presence, guys that are legendary in baseball, even to this day, like Dusty Baker. Like, who's more respected in baseball than Dusty Baker? And that was sort of Glenn's protector with the Dodgers. And so I think that went. His Dodger teammates also just loved the fact how fun Glenn was, regardless of his sexuality. They thought he was the sort of a bright spot in the clubhouse. He would come in and play his boom box and had the courage to make fun of Tommy Lasorda, which ultimately was to Glenn's detriment. But, he was a funny guy, outspoken, loud, took a little bit of pressure off, I think, during the pennant race to have a character like Glenn in the clubhouse. So his teammates, even guys like Don Sutton, Steve Garvey, they loved him. And we can talk more about why Glenn was ultimately traded to the Oakland A's. But when he was traded, there's an article talking about the number of guys that were crying in the Dodger clubhouse. Here's a guy that wasn't even starting, but was that much of a force on a great Dodger team. And when he was traded, just devastated most of the players.
All right, well, let's talk about, just get back to the baseball for a minute then. You mentioned, he has a good minor league career and obviously gets called up to the Dodgers. He's on the team that goes to the World Series in 1977. So talk a little bit about what kind of a player was he once he got to the Dodgers? What kind of role did he have on the team, on the field, and that kind of thing?
Sure. He was essentially a fourth outfielder. Rick Monday was the starting center fielder at that time, but Monday had a bad back, and so he was injured quite a bit, and Glenn would fill in as an everyday player during those stretches. Otherwise, he was used primarily as a pinch hitter or a defensive replacement late in games. And I think, something that Dusty Baker said is that he never really got a chance to show what he could do every day. When he did, during those stretches where Monday was hurt, he typically performed pretty well. He hit over 280, I think, as an everyday during those stretches for the Dodgers. He hit well against left-handed pitching to the extent that in the NLCS in 77, he started the games when Steve Carlton pitched against the Dodgers. He started game one against Don Gullett in the 77 World Series. So here's a rookie on a veteran team that Tommy Lasorda, managing his first playoffs and first World Series, had the confidence in to put in, starting positions during those games.
So he has that role as a rookie in 1977. And obviously there's probably this expectation that as the Dodgers get older and players like Monday start getting phased out, he's going to have a starting role with the team eventually. That never happens. What does happen in his career, like say in 78?
Sure. So after the 77 World Series, Glenn goes home to the Bay Area. He's back in LA for a little bit playing with an off-season basketball team that the Dodgers put together, and he was the best player on that team. And Al Campanis comes up to Oakland to meet with him. And Glenn thinks it's going to be a meeting to talk about his role with the team in 78. Instead, by this point, Campanis and Lasorda know that Glenn is gay. Tommy Lasorda's son, Tommy Jr., known as Spunky, was gay also. Glenn had become friends with him. To his dying day, Glenn never said if they were more than, just friends. But anyway, regardless, Lasorda is aware of that. And when Campanis comes up to the Bay Area, instead of talking about Glenn's role with the team next year, he offers Glenn what I would consider sort of a bribe and says, Glenn, most of the players on our team are married. When they get married, they settle down, and we would love for you to get married too. And Glenn says, to a woman? And
Right.
Campanis says yes, and Glenn says no, he's not going to do that. Campanis offers him $75,000 to get married, says they could have a nice honeymoon. At the time, $75,000 was equivalent to average major league salary. So that'd be quite a honeymoon, and Glenn realizes that they're trying to pay him off so to avoid what the Dodger management considered a public relations problem of having a gay player. Glenn refuses to go along with that. By the time spring training rolls around, there are articles in the LA papers saying that Glenn Burke's days are numbered. The reporters didn't know why. Lasorda and Campanis are talking to the reporters about Glenn being a bit of a problem on the team, that his hitting hasn't matched his fielding, and making up excuses why they don't want him around anymore. And then early in the 78 season, he's traded to the Oakland A's.
You talked about Spunky Lasorda, Tommy Lasorda's son, Tommy Lasorda Jr., and that's a really interesting part of the book and really an interesting part of Tommy Lasorda's life, and it's something that was written about a lot after Lasorda died recently. But can you just explain a little bit about the relationship between Spunky Lasorda and Glenn Burke? Just talk about that a little bit, and also talk about Tommy Lasorda's relationship with his son.
Yes, so Spunky Lasorda was probably around 19, 20 years old at this time. He was someone that hung around the Dodgers quite a bit. He would go to spring training. He would clubhouse, travel on some road trips. Dusty Baker said that he enjoyed talking to Spunky about music. Spunky was really sort of a fan of disco and introduced Dusty to a lot of his favorite disco singers. Spunky was a little bit more of a, I guess you could say, like flamboyant type of figure than Glenn. Glenn was people raved about his like 17-inch biceps. He had a body of maybe like a Yasiel Puig type of guy in a Dodger uniform, where Spunky had long blonde hair, often in a ponytail, would smoke his cigarette with one of those long cigarette holders, was a model. So one of his high school classmates said it looked like his features of his face were carved with glass, very delicate type of figure. He and Glenn became friends. At one point, they hatched this idea that they were going to scare Tommy Sr. by showing up at his house as if they were on a date with Spunky's hair pulled into pigtails. and Glenn said that they were like teasing sisters, was the kind of relationship they had. And they said that if they had shown up at Lasorda Sr.'s house like that first Lasorda would have had a heart attack and died, and then he would have shot Glenn and Spunky dead. Was the way that Glenn Burke described it. So they were close, but then all of a sudden that relationship changes. Around the time that Glenn feels like he's, going to be run off the team, Spunky becomes cold towards Glenn. He moves into a new apartment that Glenn assumes has been paid for by the Dodgers, as another way of sort of separating Glenn and Spunky. And so there was a cold ending to that relationship. In terms of Lasorda's relationship with his own son, it was mixed, I would say. I mean, this is at a time when a lot of families around the country, and to this day this still happens, but especially back then, were disowning their gay children. It's one reason why so mmany people were moving to San Francisco, where Glenn lived in the off season. These were people who were shunned by their own families in many cases. And Lasorda always maintained a relationship with his son. This story goes that, when the Dodgers were home, every Sunday he would have an Italian dinner with his son Spunky. He on lots of road trips. But on the other hand, Lasorda Sr. never acknowledged who his son was, never acknowledged that he was gay. When Spunky died of AIDS, Lasorda refused to acknowledge that was the cause of death. So it's a mixed record there.
Yeah, it's very interesting to read the quotes from him that there was an interview with a reporter after his son died where the reporter says something about the son being gay, and Tommy Lasorda basically loses it and screams at the guy and just denies it even after his son has died.
Yes, profane tirade to Peter Richmond for a GQ article and to others. And, the Lasorda was known to have those types of outbursts. I include his Dave Kingman famous outburst in the book. Also, that occurred while the Dodgers were on a road trip to Chicago, where Kingman, I think hit 3 home runs, had 8 RBIs against the Dodgers, and was asked to comment on Kingman's performance. And a lot of people have heard that sound clip.
That's my favorite.
I had to bleep a lot of it out for the book.
What is my opinion of Kingman's performance? It's the greatest. If people haven't heard that, go to YouTube right now and remedy that, because it's on there.
Exactly.
So, we mentioned that the book is written kind of with the high school audience in mind, high school and older, like we said. But even when it's a book written for a younger audience, you still have to go through the research process that you would if this was a more, quote unquote, adult book. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, about the process of researching this book, who you talked to, what kind of sources you went